Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Um, Today we're going to be talking about something a little bit different,
Okay.
and that is preparing for death.
Hmm.
But before you click that skip button, let me assure you, this isn't going to be a morbid or depressing conversation.
Yeah, I can see how people would think that, right?
Exactly. Death is a topic that most of us try to avoid, but we're going to approach it from a different angle today.
I like that.
Yeah. So instead of fearing death, we're going to explore how thinking about our eventual exit can actually deepen our understanding of life.
Makes sense to me.
We're going to be looking at excerpts from a talk by a spiritual teacher,
Okay.
and he really dives deep into this idea of preparing for a good death.
Interesting. What's his main point?
Well, one of the first things he emphasizes is the uniqueness of death. It's not just an ending,
Right.
but a one-time transition, unlike anything we experience in life.
I've never thought about it that way.
Yeah, he compares it to preparing for a journey. And he asks us to consider this. You wouldn't just pack a small bag for a year-long trek to the Amazon, right?
Well, no, of course not.
Well, he suggests the afterlife requires even more thorough preparation than our current life.
Wow, that's a powerful analogy.
It really is. And it makes you think about our priorities, doesn't it?
For sure.
We spend so much time preparing for things like, careers and vacations and relationships.
Yeah, all the big things in life.
Exactly.
Uh,
But what about the ultimate journey? This speaker is definitely challenging us to think outside the box.
totally. And speaking of journeys, he goes on to suggest that dying peacefully can dramatically influence our experience after death.
Hmm. I can see that.
Fear and resistance, on the other hand, can create a much more difficult transition.
That makes sense.
He even talks about leaving the body consciously,
What do you mean by that?
almost as if we're simply taking off clothes.
Really? Like just slipping out of it?
Exactly. He claims that when he dies, he'll be so aware that he can consciously choose to leave his body.
Wow. That's a pretty radical idea.
It is. He actually says that he'll walk to his own grave.
He's going to walk to his own grave.
That's what he says.
Wow. What do you make of that?
Well, it speaks to the profound level of awareness he's cultivated.
Yeah, they can see that.
And it challenges a common misconception we often see in movies,
Which is?
that death is always instantaneous.
Right, like in the movie someone gets shot and they just drop dead instantly.
Exactly. He argues that even in accidents or trauma, there's always a space between injury and death.
Really? Even in those situations?
He says there are always moments that can be incredibly transformative for those who have cultivated awareness.
So even in what we perceive as sudden death, there's still an opportunity for conscious choice.
That's what he's suggesting.
That's a pretty empowering thought,
Yep.
wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It kind of puts us back in the driver's seat.
So it's not just about the moment of death itself.
Right. It's about the state of mind we cultivate throughout our lives.
He also draws this fascinating parallel between sleep and death.
Oh, yeah. What does he say about that?
He suggests that practicing awareness during those moments when we drift off to sleep can actually help us prepare for the final transition.
That's interesting.
Think about it. Can you be aware in the moment you fall asleep?
That's a tough one. I'm usually pretty out of it by then.
Me too.
Yeah.
But it makes sense that if we can master that level of awareness in sleep, it could have a profound impact on how we experience death.
Definitely. It's like training for a marathon.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You wouldn't just show up on race day without any preparation.
He even suggests that the quality you bring to those final moments before sleep can influence the quality of your sleep itself.
What do you mean?
Like if you go to bed stressed and anxious, you're more likely to have a restless sleep.
Right.
But if you cultivate a sense of peace and relaxation, you're more likely to sleep soundly.
That makes sense.
And he says this principle applies to death as well.
Interesting. So the state of mind we cultivate throughout our lives can actually impact our experience of death.
That's what he's suggesting.
A lot to think about. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about this concept of ojas.
Okay.
The speaker describes it as a subtle energy that can ease our passage through life and death.
Ojas, I've heard of that.
He even compares it to a life raft for a person lost at sea.
A life raft.
Yeah, so if you're stranded in the middle of the ocean with no land in sight, a life raft can mean the difference between life and death.
Wait.
Well, he's saying that ojas is like that. It can help us navigate the transition after death with more ease.
I see.
And what's really interesting is that he explains how certain practices can actually transform physical matter into ojas.
Transform physical matter, like how?
He doesn't go into specifics, but he mentions things like meditation and yoga and living a virtuous life.
Okay.
And the more ojas we have, the less resistance we experience, both in life and in death.
So it's not just about preparing for death. It's about living a more fulfilling life in the present moment.
Exactly. He's suggesting that these two things are interconnected.
Makes sense. Have you ever considered that our physical actions could have such a profound impact on our spiritual well-being?
I have to admit, it's not something I've thought about much before, but it makes sense that if we can refine our physical energy into something more subtle, it could help us navigate these transitions with more grace.
It's like upgrading our operating system.
Exactly. We're not just stuck with the default settings.
Uh-huh.
We can actually choose to evolve and expand our consciousness,
He also tackles this universal fear of death.
which we all have to some degree.
Right, and he attributes it to our limited identification with the physical body.
Okay,
He finds it illogical that we're terrified of dead bodies, which can't actually harm us.
right.
Yet we fear living bodies, which have the potential to cause pain.
Yeah. It's like we're afraid of the wrong thing.
It's as if we're not truly in touch with reality.
It's funny when you put it that way. It does seem a bit backward,
Yeah.
but I can see how clinging to this physical form could create a lot of anxiety around death. What do you think?
I agree. He argues that this fear stems from a lack of understanding
A lack of understanding of what?
of our true nature. He believes that if we explored other dimensions of experience beyond the physical, the body wouldn't be such a big deal.
So it's about expanding our awareness beyond the physical realm.
Exactly. He says we wouldn't be so attached to the body and therefore wouldn't make such a fuss about shedding it when the time comes.
Okay, I can see that. He even compares it to gaining and losing weight.
Oh, yeah. How so?
He says we don't mourn the loss of extra pounds, so why should we mourn the loss of the body when it's time for it to go?
That's an interesting analogy.
It is. It's a provocative way of looking at it.
Yeah.
So if this fear of death is rooted in our attachment to the physical, how do we overcome it?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
He suggests that exploring those other dimensions of experience can help us diminish this fear.
Okay.
It allows us to see the body as a temporary vehicle rather than our core identity.
We're not just our bodies. We're something more than that.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that death itself isn't painful.
It's not.
He says it's the breakdown of the body that causes suffering.
I see.
He uses this analogy of someone falling from a building.
Oh, no.
He says they might say the fall itself didn't hurt. It was the sudden stop at the end.
Oof. That's a pretty dark humor way of illustrating his point.
It is, but it does highlight the distinction between pain and death itself.
So pain and death are not the same thing.
Right. He's suggesting that the fear of death is often conflated with the fear of pain, which is a natural survival mechanism.
Makes sense.
But death, he argues, is something entirely different. And by recognizing that we can start to approach it with a sense of curiosity rather than dread.
So how do we go about preparing for a good death? Are there specific practices we can incorporate into our lives?
He offers a few powerful tools for cultivating awareness.
Like what?
One is the practice of death reminders,
Death reminders.
where you consciously contemplate your own mortality on a regular basis.
That sounds a bit intense.
It can be.
Yeah.
But he shares this incredible story of a vegetable vendor who was bedridden for months and believed he was dying.
Oh, wow.
And when he recovered, he experienced such profound bliss that he no longer feared death.
Really? Just from facing his own mortality?
It seems so. He now blesses everyone who buys vegetables from him with the words, "May you also become ill like me."
That's a pretty wild story.
Yeah.
Do you think there's something about confronting our mortality that can lead to such a shift in perspective?
It's certainly possible. He also talks about shunya meditation.
Shunya meditation, what's that?
It's a practice designed to simulate a mini-death experience.
A mini-death experience.
It involves reaching a state where your body thinks you've fallen asleep,
Yeah.
but your mind is still awake and aware, experiencing a sense of nothingness.
It sounds like a pretty intense practice.
It can be, but he says it can help us familiarize ourselves with the feeling of non-existence and ease the fear of death.
That makes sense. And that brings us to another interesting concept, Vanaprastha Ashrama.
Vanaprastha Ashrama, right?
Do you remember what that's all about?
Yeah, it's an ancient tradition where people would withdraw from worldly affairs later in life to prepare for death.
They would often retire to the forest, right?
Exactly.
So it's about removing ourselves from the distractions of everyday life and focusing on our spiritual growth.
He clarifies that it's not necessarily about living in a forest, although that was the traditional practice.
Okay.
It's more about removing ourselves from the illusion of immortality that can come from living within four walls.
Interesting thought. So it's about stepping outside of our comfort zones, both physically and mentally, to confront the reality of our mortality. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's a powerful practice even if we don't literally retire to the forest.
Yeah. How could we adapt this to our modern lives?
He suggests that the modern equivalent could be something like retiring to a peaceful countryside setting or joining a spiritual community that supports this conscious approach to death.
It's an interesting thought. Instead of dreading retirement, we could view it as an opportunity to shift our focus and prepare for the next chapter of existence.
Right. It's about embracing the natural cycle of life.
He also reiterates his point about the potential drawbacks of dying at home surrounded by family.
Oh, yeah. Why does he say that again?
Do you remember?
Because it can create stronger attachments that make it harder to let go.
Even though it seems comforting to be surrounded by loved ones.
Exactly. He suggests that dying in a more detached environment, surrounded by individuals who support a conscious transition, can create a more peaceful and graceful experience.
So it's about minimizing distractions and creating the optimal conditions for a conscious exit.
Right.
This brings us back to Sallekhana, which can seem like an extreme approach to death.
Yeah, it's definitely not for everyone.
But it raises interesting questions about our modern obsession with prolonging life at all costs.
That's a big one.
Right.
He contrasts Sallekhana with our tendency to cling to life through medical interventions, even when it means prolonging suffering and diminishing quality of life.
I can see that.
He uses the example of elderly individuals who have lost their memories, but still cling to the desire to attract the opposite sex. He's highlighting the emptiness of holding on to physical desires without any awareness of a deeper dimension of existence.
It's a stark reminder that extending lifespan doesn't necessarily equate to extending quality of life. And Sallekhana, while certainly not for everyone, points to a different possibility.
Exactly. It's about choosing how we want to die, rather than just letting it happen to us.
He emphasizes that Sallekhana was traditionally practiced with the guidance of spiritual mentors.
Right. It wasn't something you just decided to do on your own.
And it involved a gradual reduction of food and water intake, allowing for a more conscious and intentional withdrawal from the physical body.
It was a process.
It's a powerful reminder that we have more agency in the dying process than we often realize. We could either be swept away by it, or we can choose to navigate it with awareness and dignity.
And he also highlights the importance of consulting with family community elders and spiritual advisors when considering practices like Sallekhana.
It was a decision made with careful consideration and support, not taken lightly.
Right. It was a community affair.
It's a stark contrast to how we approach death in our modern individualistic society, where it's often seen as a taboo subject shrouded in secrecy and fear.
Yeah, we've really lost touch with the communal aspect of death.
He advocates for a more open and honest approach, where death is discussed openly and consciously prepared for both individually and as a community.
I like that.
He even mentions that in the past, spiritually evolved individuals were often present at deathbeds to offer guidance and support.
It's a beautiful image, having someone with spiritual wisdom to guide you through those final moments.
It is. But even if such support isn't available, he reminds us that we can still prepare ourselves for a good death through practices like meditation, contemplation, and conscious living.
So we're not powerless in this process.
Exactly. It's about taking responsibility for our own death, rather than leaving it to chance or fear.
He concludes by saying, just as you make efforts to live, you should also make efforts to prepare to die. You should decide, in case I die, I want to die like this.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. It's a call to action, isn't it?
It is. He's urging us to face death with awareness and intention.
He reminds us that death is inevitable, but we have a choice in how we approach it. We can either die kicking and screaming, clinging to the past,
Right.
or we can die peacefully and consciously embracing the transition with grace and dignity.
It's a beautiful way to frame it.
It is. It's a profound message that invites us to reconsider our relationship with death and to begin preparing ourselves for a good death, not just for our own sake, but for the sake of those around us as well.
And maybe even for the sake of the world.
Yes, absolutely.
He leaves us with this final thought. If you want to die, well, you have to cultivate a certain amount of dispassion towards your own death.
Dispassion towards our own death.
It's a reminder that letting go is essential, not just in life, but also in death.
Lots to think about there.
Definitely. It's interesting, right, how we kind of avoid even thinking about death in our modern world.
Yeah, for sure. It's like the ultimate taboo.
Exactly. But this speaker is like, hey, embrace it.
Embrace death.
He says it's a natural part of life.
Okay, I get that. But embrace it.
He thinks exploring it actually makes our lives better right now.
Makes sense. I guess if we're less afraid of it.
Right. Like it loses its power over us.
So how do we even begin to prepare for something we don't know?
He talks about living consciously, especially as we age.
Okay.
He says most creatures just know how to die gracefully.
They do.
Yeah, like they withdraw to a quiet place.
To die.
Yeah, when their time is near.
Huh. We're not so good at that.
Nope. He says humans cling to life desperately.
So it makes for a messier ending.
Kind of makes you wonder, right,
About
if our fear of death stops us from living fully.
even as we get older.
He actually thinks old age is a blessing.
A blessing. How?
It gives us a chance to reflect on our lives, gain some deeper insights.
Like we've reached the top of the mountain.
Exactly. We can look back at the whole path.
All the ups and downs, good times and bad.
All of it. It adds to the richness of the journey.
Do you think that perspective would change our priorities?
If we knew our time was limited.
Yeah. Would we waste it on things that don't matter?
That's what he's saying.
So what should we be focusing on then?
He talks about taking care of our physical and mental well-being.
So we can actually enjoy our old age.
He says as our body naturally starts to, recede,
With age.
yeah, it becomes easier to detach from it.
Like we're not so identified with our physical form.
Which makes sense, right?
It does.
Yeah.
It creates space for greater awareness
To understand who we really are.
beyond the physical body.
He even suggests a simple practice.
Oh, yeah. What is it?
Postponing
Hey.
meals.
When you're hungry,
Yeah, just by like 10 minutes.
that's it.
It's about becoming aware of the hunger.
Not just giving into it immediately.
Right. You observe how it feels in the body
To create some distance.
between your experience and those physical sensations.
It's a subtle shift, but I can see how it could help.
Become more aware of the body.
As something separate. Not who we are completely.
He also mentions fasting to deepen this awareness.
Fasting,
And he brings up Vanaprastha Ashrama again. Remember that.
yeah. People withdrawing from family and society.
Later in life,
Often retiring to the forest.
to prepare for death.
Yeah. Right.
He's saying it wasn't about hardship, removing yourself from distractions.
Of worldly life.
That illusion of immortality.
The one that comes with four walls.
Exactly. It was about reconnecting with nature.
Facing the elements, acknowledging impermanence.
Sounds pretty radical, huh?
It does. But I get it. Simplifying life, focusing on what matters.
Makes you wonder, how could we do that today?
Adapt it to our modern lives.
He suggests retiring to a peaceful countryside setting
Okay.
or joining a spiritual community.
One that supports a conscious approach to death.
Yeah. It's interesting, right?
Instead of being scared of retirement,
We could see it as an opportunity.
to prepare for what's next.
He also talks about dying at home again.
Surrounded by family.
He still advises against it.
I remember. Why is that again?
Being surrounded by loved ones.
Makes it harder to let go.
Even though it seems comforting.
He says it creates stronger attachments.
It's like trying to let go of a balloon.
While everyone is holding the strings.
Exactly.
So where should we die then?
He suggests a more detached environment
With people who support a conscious transition.
to minimize distractions.
Create the right conditions for a conscious exit.
Which brings us back to Sallekhana.
That can seem extreme, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
But it makes you think our obsession with prolonging life,
At all costs.
even when it means more suffering.
Less quality of life.
He compares it to, elderly people who have lost their memories,
Okay.
but still, want to attract the opposite sex.
You're saying it's empty.
To cling to those physical desires.
Without any awareness of something deeper.
Sallekhana points to a different possibility.
Choosing how we want to die.
Not just letting it happen.
He emphasizes that traditionally it was done with guidance from spiritual mentors.
And it was gradual. Reducing food and water intake.
Intentionally withdrawing from the body
Powerful reminder, we have more agency than we think.
in the dying process.
We can be swept away, or we can choose.
To navigate it with awareness, dignity.
He also talks about consulting with family elders, spiritual advisors.
Before doing something like Sallekhana.
It was a community decision.
Not a solo mission.
So different from today.
Death is a secret. Something to fear.
He wants us to be more open, honest.
Prepare for it, individually and as a community.
He even mentions in the past,
Yeah.
spiritually evolved people were at deathbeds.
To offer guidance.
It's a beautiful image, right?
It is. Having that kind of support.
Even if we don't have that, he says we can still prepare.
Through meditation. Contemplation.
Conscious living. It's about taking responsibility
For our own dead.
instead of leaving it to chance or fear.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about this Kashi thing?
Kashi.
The city in India known for death and liberation.
Oh, yeah. Have you ever thought about going there?
Can't say it's the top of my list.
Yeah.
But I'm curious.
Although,
A city that embraces death?
instead of being afraid of it,
He says traditionally people believed.
that dying there would lead to liberation.
Moksha, freedom from the cycle of birth and death.
He talks about Bhairavayatana.
What that?
It happens at the moment of death in Kashi.
What happens?
Intense karmic purification.
Like all your past actions?
You experience them all at once.
That sounds intense.
A lifetime's worth of baggage in an instant.
But maybe liberating in the end.
He calls it a cosmic reset button.
Clearing the slate before moving on.
And Shiva oversees the process.
To make sure people are liberated.
He emphasizes Kashi wasn't meant just for dying.
It was.
A vibrant city full of temples, ashrams, teachers,
People went there to prepare for death.
while they were living,
Life and death intertwined.
celebrated with equal reverence.
He also talks about the cremation grounds,
The fires have been burning continuously,
which is the beginning of time,
representing that eternal cycle.
of life and death,
Kashi is like a microcosm,
of Indian civilization.
where life and death are both part of the tapestry,
He acknowledges it's not what it once was.
but it still holds a powerful energy.
So even a modern visit could be impactful,
He compares it to other consecrated spaces,
like the Dhyanalinga,
where life is more intense.
and death more efficient,
These places accelerate spiritual growth.
both in life and in death,
It's like a different dimension.
where the veil is thinner,
He says Kashi may not guarantee liberation.
but it can bring you closer.
If you go with the right intention,
It's about creating the conditions,
for a conscious and graceful death,
not looking for a magic solution,
but engaging with these deeper questions.
using these spaces to help us evolve.
He encourages us to explore these concepts,
See how they apply to our own lives.
regardless of our beliefs or background,
It's an invitation to step outside our comfort zones
to explore the mysteries of death.
with curiosity and courage. It's amazing, all this stuff about death we don't usually think about.
Right. We just kind of push it away.
Yeah, focus on the grief, the loss, but there's so much more.
This deep dive, it's been eye-opening.
Yeah, for sure. This speaker, he really gave us a lot to think about.
Instead of fearing death, he's like, see it as a transition.
A continuation in a different form.
Liberating and kind of empowering, too.
Instead of just letting life happen, we can be proactive
Even about our own death. He gives us some tools.
for cultivating awareness.
Yeah, like death reminders. Have you ever thought about that?
Consciously contemplating my own mortality. Not really.
It can shift your perspective, make you appreciate each day.
Bring death into the light instead of hiding it.
He also talks about Shinya meditation.
That mini-death experience.
Yeah, to get familiar with letting go.
He also talks about creating the right context for death.
Like withdrawing to a peaceful place.
Vanaprastha Ashrama.
Or just being with supportive people.
What's the key takeaway there, do you think?
We have more control over dying than we realize.
We can create a peaceful environment mentally, emotionally.
He also challenges us about prolonging life at all costs.
Even when it means suffering.
It's a tough conversation, but important.
There's a natural time for everything, knowing when to let go.
He contrasts it with Sallekhana.
Intentionally tapering down the life force.
What are your thoughts on that one?
It's radical, definitely not for everyone. But it shows us we have choices.
About how we die? It's a challenge. How do we want to live our final days?
And how we want to leave this world.
He emphasizes Sallekhana was done with guidance.
From the community.
It wasn't a solo decision, it was carefully considered.
So different from today, death is taboo, a secret.
He wants us to be more open, talk about it, prepare.
Individually, and as a community, imagine that.
If we talked about death as easily as we talk about life,
It would change things for sure.
he reminds us death is inevitable.
But we have a choice.
How we approach it. We can be swept away or...
We can navigate it with awareness, dignity, even grace.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive.
About preparing for a good death.
Hopefully it sparks some curiosity.
Made you think about death in a new light.
It's not about obsession, but integrating awareness.
Into our lives so we can live more fully consciously.
Like he said, what steps can WE take today to prepare?
And how will that make our lives richer right now?
Death, it can be a doorway to something more.
Beyond what we understand now.
Keep diving deep, everyone.
Explore the mysteries of life and beyond.